My name is Mara Ellison, and I was 35 years old the Thanksgiving my family left my table untouched. I had been awake since 6 that morning. Because cooking was what I did when I was scared. Some people prayed, some people paced. I measured butter, folded napkins, and made sure every fork sat exactly 1 inch from the edge of the plate, as if precision could keep people from leaving. It was my first Thanksgiving in the little house I had bought in Kansas City, the first place with a dining room big enough for all of them. 9 chairs, 9 handwritten name cards. A turkey so heavy I had to brace one knee against the oven door to pull it out. Cornbread stuffing, green bean casserole, cranberry orange relish, and the apple cider bread pudding Grandpa Bennett had taught me to make when I was too small to see over his counter. By 10, the house smelled like sage, brown sugar, and hope. By 11:15, the first text came from Tessa. Something came up. Rain check? Nolan followed 20 minutes later. Work emergency. You know how it is. My mother, Celeste, did not text. She simply stopped answering. At 3:30, while the turkey rested under foil and the candles burned halfway down, Facebook showed me the truth. Tessa had posted a photo from her dining room. My mother smiling beside the good china. My father raising a glass. Nolan carving turkey. Everyone there. Everyone dressed. Everyone laughing around a table I had not been invited to. I called Celeste, with my hand still dusted in flour. She answered over the sound of silverware and voices. Mara, she said, already tired of me. Why didn't anyone come? There was a pause. Then she said, we only had room for one family table this year. And she hung up. So I sat at the head of my beautiful table, with 8 empty chairs staring back at me, and ate one cold bite of turkey alone. That was when the doorbell rang. Before I opened that door, before I saw who had crossed half of Kansas City in the cold to stand on my porch, I need you to understand why Celeste's sentence did not shock me the way it should have. It hurt, of course. It landed somewhere old. But it also fit so neatly into the shape of my life that part of me simply made room for it, the way I had been taught to make room for everything they did. In the Calder family, I had always been treated like a guest, who should be grateful the visit had lasted this long. In public, they knew how to make it look softer. Christmas cards said, Our Mara. Church friends heard Celeste talk about raising 3 children. Graham put his hand on my shoulder in school pictures, and smiled like a man who had done the decent thing. But inside the house, where kindness did not need witnesses, the language changed. I was not their daughter when Celeste was tired or angry or trying to remind me of my place. I was the child we made room for. That phrase followed me through childhood like my name written wrong on every form. Tessa got new coats. I got the coats after her initials had already been marked inside the collar. Nolan got baseball fees, summer camps, and eventually a used pickup because Graham said a boy needed something that was his. Tessa cried over algebra and a private tutor appeared by Monday. I brought home straight A's, and Celeste nodded without looking up from the sink, as if excellence was useful but not impressive coming from me. So I learned to become useful in ways no one could ignore. I set tables at family parties before I was tall enough to reach the cabinet where Celeste kept the good plates. I watched cousins in back bedrooms during weddings where I was never asked to stand in the formal photos. I filled out Nolan's financial aid forms because paperwork made him impatient. Later, when I became a forensic billing auditor for a hospital system, the family discovered that I was very convenient to have around whenever an insurance denial arrived, a bill looked wrong, or somebody needed a form explained without paying a professional. Celeste thanked me in the way she did everything, with sweetness wrapped around a hook. See, Mara, she would say, sliding another folder across the counter. Everyone has a place in a family. She meant mine was service. For years, I mistook being needed for being loved. That Thanksgiving table had been my last quiet attempt to prove I belonged. 9 plates. 9 names. 1 childish hope still waiting to be proven wrong. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 8. If not, Type 9. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. When the bell rang, I stayed seated for a moment with my fork still in my hand, listening to the sound fade through the quiet house. No one came to my door without warning. Not my family, not the neighbors. Even delivery drivers usually left packages on the step and disappeared before I could reach the knob. For one foolish second, I let myself imagine Celeste, standing there with a covered dish and a tight little smile, ready to pretend the whole day had been a misunderstanding. But when I opened the door, it was Grandpa Bennett. He stood under the porch light in a thin brown coat, wet snow clinging to his shoulders, his silver hair damp from the sleet. Otis Rains from church had driven him as far as the curb, I learned later, but Bennett had insisted on walking the last few steps himself. One hand gripped the porch rail, the other held something flat against his chest. His breathing was shallow, and the cold had turned his fingers almost white. "They told me you weren't doing Thanksgiving this year," he said. His voice was soft, but it was not lost. It was not foggy. It was the voice of a man who had found one clear path through all the confusion everyone kept blaming on age. I pulled him inside before I answered. His hands were cold enough to make anger rise in me again, clean and sharp. I wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, sat him near the heat vent, and brought him warm cider in the blue mug with the chipped handle, the one he always chose when he visited. He did not drink right away. He kept looking past me at the dining room table, at the untouched plates, the folded napkins, the name cards, still standing like small witnesses. "I went to Tessa's," he said. "Celeste said everybody was there." I did not correct the name. Not yet. He stared at my table for a long time. "There were 9 cards on her sideboard," he said, "but only 8 people sitting down." His mouth tightened. I counted twice. That was what broke something open in me. Not the photo. Not the cold food. Not even Celeste saying there was only room for one family table. It was the fact that an 81-year-old man they kept calling confused had remembered to count the chair they erased on purpose. Then Bennett reached into his coat and pulled out a yellowed envelope, soft at the corners, sealed once and opened many times. My name was written across the front in faded ink. "For Mara," he said, "when the lie gets too heavy." I looked up at him. Elodie made me promise. The name meant nothing to me, and somehow my body reacted before my mind did, going still in a way I could not explain. Inside the envelope were a photograph, a folded letter, a small brass key, and a birth certificate. I unfolded the certificate first, because paper had always felt safer than feelings. The page trembled once in my hand. Then my eyes reached the line marked Mother. Elodie Calder. 2 days after Grandpa Bennett told me who Elodie was, I stood in the lobby of Heartland Community Bank with the brass key closed inside my fist and Bennett's authorization folded in my purse. He had called the branch himself that morning, on one of his clear days, with me sitting beside him at his kitchen table and Lydia Bell listening from the hallway. I watched him say my full name into the phone. Mara Ellison. I watched him tell them I had permission to access the box. I watched his hand shake only after he hung up. The key was small enough to lose in a coat pocket, but I held it like it could bruise. By the time Quentin Rook came out to meet me, the metal had gone warm from my palm. He was the branch operations manager, the kind of man who read every page before he decided what his face was allowed to show. He checked my license, Bennett's authorization, the account notes, then the key. Twice. The safe deposit room was colder than the lobby, with beige walls, a narrow table, and a silence that made every movement sound official. Quentin slid the long metal box in front of me, then stepped outside and closed the door. For a while, I only looked at it. Then I lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle tied with faded blue ribbon, 3 photographs, a copy of my birth certificate, a savings ledger, and a letter with my name written in handwriting I did not recognize, but somehow wanted to. The first photograph showed a young woman sitting on the back steps of Bennett's house, holding a toddler in yellow overalls. Me. Her cheek was pressed to the top of my head like she was listening to me breathe. I had spent 35 years being told I arrived in the Calder family as an obligation, but in that picture, I was not an obligation. I was held like an answer. The letter was worse. Kinder, which made it worse. Elodie wrote that she had worked double shifts at a pharmacy and cleaned offices on weekends. She had opened a small account for me with $6,300, not because it was a fortune, but because she wanted me to have something no one could call charity. If they ever make her feel like a burden, she wrote, tell her I worked for this. Tell her she was wanted. The ledger showed Bennett had kept adding to it for birthdays, Christmases, and ordinary Tuesdays when, I think, missing her became too heavy. By his last handwritten total, the fund should have been close to $74,000. Quentin printed the current statement before I left. The balance was almost gone. And suddenly, my mother's last gift was no longer only love. It was evidence. I did not drive home right away after leaving the bank. I sat in my car with the sealed envelope Quentin had given me on the passenger seat and the heater blowing against my knees. With Bennett's written authorization, Quentin had printed more than the current balance of Elodie's fund. He had given me 9 months of account history, every transfer that moved through the accounts Celeste had been touching since the spring. The pages looked ordinary at first. That was what made them ugly. People think theft looks frantic, like someone grabbing bills from a drawer. Most of the time, it looks organized. It has memo lines. It has dates spaced far enough apart to seem reasonable. It wears the face of paperwork. By the time I got back to Bennett's house, he was asleep in his recliner with a quilt over his legs and an old western playing low on the television. Lydia Bell, his home health nurse, met me in the kitchen. She saw the bank envelope in my hand and went still. Was it bad? She asked. I did not show her the numbers. Not yet. I only said, bad enough. She looked toward the living room, where Bennett slept with one hand, resting open on the arm of the chair, and something in her face told me she had been afraid of that answer for a while. I opened my laptop at Bennett's kitchen table, the same table where Elodie had probably eaten breakfast as a girl, and started building the kind of spreadsheet I usually built for hospital claims. Date, amount, account, recipient, memo, supporting document, missing document. My hands stopped shaking once the columns were in place. Grief made me useless. Structure gave me somewhere to put it. The first transfer was in March, not long after Bennett's mild stroke. Celeste had been given power of attorney, for convenience, according to the bank record. 6 weeks later, $18,500 went to Tessa, labeled temporary family support. No repayment schedule. No note. No explanation of how Tessa's support benefited Bennett. In April, $14,200 went to Nolan under acquiescence. In May, $27,900 left for the down payment on Celeste's SUV. By June, $31,600 had paid for a kitchen remodel at Celeste and Graham's house. July showed $22,000 toward Nolan's tax debt. September had $9,800 sent to a realtor connected to the possible sale of Bennett's property. Then I found the care account. That one made the room tilt. It had held $186,400, money meant to keep Bennett in his own home with help, dignity, and heat in the winter. By Thanksgiving, it held $3,740. I printed every page. I highlighted nothing. Highlighting was emotion, and I did not trust mine yet. I only lined the numbers up and let them speak in order. By midnight, the pattern was clear. Celeste had not taken everything at once. She had harvested him. The next morning, Lydia Bell arrived at 7:30 with her nursing bag in one hand and a paper grocery sack in the other. She had brought oatmeal, bananas, and the kind of quiet women bring into houses where something ugly has happened but no one is ready to say the word yet. Bennett was still asleep, his breathing slow and uneven from the recliner, and the spreadsheet was open on my laptop like a second accusation. Lydia set the groceries on the counter, then looked at the printed bank pages stacked beside me. "I need to show you something," she said. She did not sound dramatic. That frightened me more than if she had. From her bag, she pulled out a thin folder of care notes, copies she had made for her own records because, as she put it, "I learned a long time ago to write down what people later pretend never happened." She sat across from me and turned the pages one by one, her finger moving down the dates. March 18. Bennett disoriented after medication. Could not identify current month. March 19. Family visit from Celeste. Patient tired. Repeated questions. I looked back at my spreadsheet. March 19 was the day Bennett had signed the power of attorney addendum giving Celeste broader access to his financial accounts. Lydia turned another page. May 6. Patient confused about location after afternoon dose. Needed repeated explanation of who was present. May 6 was the day $27,900 left for Celeste's SUV down payment. June 14. Patient unable to follow multi-step conversation. Became agitated when asked to sign papers. June 14 was the kitchen remodel transfer. The room went very quiet around us. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a glass breaks and everyone is waiting to see who will bleed. Lydia's face had gone pale. "I thought they were medical forms," she said. "Celeste always said it was insurance, home care, routine things. I didn't know it was money." I believed her. Maybe because she was the first person in days who looked horrified by what had happened, instead of inconvenienced by the possibility of consequences. We kept going. The realtor payment had been made the same afternoon. Bennett's notes said he could not remember whether he had eaten lunch. The draft sale authorization had been signed on a day Lydia had written, in careful blue ink. Patient required redirection 6 times during one conversation. I took each nurse note and matched it to each transfer, each signature, each memo line that had pretended to be harmless. By noon, the pattern had changed shape. Celeste had not only used authority, she had chosen weakness. That was when I called Marisol Kent, the elder law attorney, whose name Quentin had quietly written on the back of his business card. I described the bank records first, then the care notes, then the dates. Marisol listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Mara, this is no longer a family disagreement." I looked at Bennett sleeping in the next room. She said, "This is a paper trail." Marisol Kent's office was on the 4th floor of a brick building downtown, above a dental practice and a title company. It did not look like the kind of place where families came apart. There were no marble floors, no dramatic glass walls, no receptionist whispering into a headset. Just 2 lamps, a wall of file cabinets, and a woman with gray hair pinned at the back of her neck, who listened like every word had weight. I laid everything on her conference table in the order I had built it. Bank records first. Then Lydia's care notes. Then the authorization Bennett had signed while he was clear. Then the copy of the draft sale paperwork tied to his house. I kept Elodie's letter in my purse. That one was not evidence yet. Not to me. Not in that room. It was still too warm to place under fluorescent lights. Marisol read quietly. She did not gasp. Good attorneys rarely do. They save their reactions for court filings. After 20 minutes, she took off her glasses and said, "We have several paths, but we need to move carefully." Carefully. I hated the word and needed it at the same time. She explained that Celeste's power of attorney did not make Bennett's money hers. It made her responsible for using it only for his benefit. If the records showed she had used his accounts for her car, her kitchen, Nolan's taxes, Tessa's support, or a real estate deal that benefited the family more than Bennett, then we could ask the court for a formal accounting. We could request emergency suspension of Celeste's authority. We could report suspected elder financial exploitation. We could ask for a neutral fiduciary, someone with no blood in the fight, and no reason to lie at Christmas dinner. None of it sounded like revenge. That helped me breathe. "What I don't want," I said, "is for them to say I'm doing this because of the inheritance." Marisol looked at me for a long second. "Then we make the record clear. You are asking to protect Bennett, not to enrich yourself." The word protect moved through me slowly. I had spent my life trying to earn protection from people who treated it like a luxury. Now I was being told I could give it to someone else through paperwork, signatures, and a courthouse clerk. So, that was what we did. No Facebook post, no family group text, no recording Celeste while she said something cruel enough to share. We gathered documents. We requested full statements. We prepared a petition. Marisol called Adult Protective Services with language so calm, it made the facts sound even worse. Celeste called that evening. "I hear you've been poking around Bennett's accounts," she said. "He asked me to look. He doesn't know what he's asking, and neither do you." Then came the sentence she always used when she wanted me small. "You were never really a Calder, Mara. You were just the child we made room for." This time, I did not shrink. "Then you should have been more careful," I said, with the paperwork that says otherwise. And I hung up first. I went to see Graham 3 days later, not because I believed he would save me, but because some part of me still needed to know how far the silence had gone. He opened the door before I knocked twice. He looked older than he had on Thanksgiving, though only a week had passed. His gray sweatshirt hung loose at the neck. His eyes moved past my shoulder, checking the driveway, the street, the neighbor's porch, as if the truth might have followed me there in a marked car. "Celeste isn't home," he said. I didn't come for Celeste. That seemed to frighten him more. We sat at his kitchen table, the same table where I had filled out Nolan's tax extension 2 years earlier while Graham watched football in the next room and called me a lifesaver without looking away from the screen. I did not bring the bank records. I did not bring Lydia's notes. I brought one photograph and one letter. I placed the photograph between us. Elodie sat on Bennett's back steps, holding me in yellow overalls. Her face was turned down toward mine, soft with a kind of attention I had spent my whole life trying to earn from people who had already spent it elsewhere. Graham stared at it for a long time. His mouth opened once, closed. "She looks like you," he said. "No," I said. "I look like her." That broke something in his face. I slid the letter beside the photograph. "Did you know?" He did not ask what I meant. That was the answer, before he gave me one. His hands folded together on the table, knuckles pale. "Mara, did you know Elodie was my mother?" He looked toward the hallway, toward the rooms Celeste had decorated, in creams and golds and family portraits, where Elodie did not exist. Yes. The word was small. Smaller than I expected. Smaller than 32 years deserved. I waited for the apology that should have followed it. Instead, he rubbed both hands over his face and said, "Your mother was grieving. Celeste had lost a baby that year. Then Elodie died, and suddenly there was you, and Bennett wanted everything was complicated." Complicated. That was what weak people called cruelty when they wanted it to sound like weather. I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest since the bank. "Did you erase her because it hurt, or because it was easier?" He flinched like I had raised my hand. For 1 second, I saw a brother in him. A man who had once loved Elodie, who had probably carried her books, teased her at dinner, known the sound of her laugh before it became forbidden. Then the second passed, and he became what he had chosen to be. "Don't tear this family apart," he whispered. I stood. "You did that," I said. "You just left me to find the pieces." As I reached the door, he said, "Celeste is planning a Calder Family Gratitude Dinner before Christmas. At Dad's house. She wants everyone to see she's still in charge." I looked back at him. For the first time in my life, Graham Calder had told me the truth before it was useful to him. By the next morning, the family that had not had room for me at Thanksgiving suddenly found my number very easy to use. Tessa texted first. Not an apology, not even a question about Bennett, just a careful little message, dressed in concern. "Whatever Grandpa gave you, we should probably talk about it as a family." I stared at the word family until it stopped looking like a word and started looking like a tool. They had used it to leave me out, to keep me grateful, to make silence sound noble. Now they were using it because they were afraid I had something they could not take back. Nolan called at noon. I let it go to voicemail. He left one anyway, his voice tight and too loud, the way it got when he owed money. You have no idea what you're messing with, Mara. If that house sale gets delayed, people get hurt. Real people. My business is tied up in this. You can't just blow up everyone's life because Grandpa got emotional. Grandpa got emotional. That was what he called an old man trying to protect the roof over his own head. Celeste waited until evening. She always liked an audience, even when there was none. Her voice came through smooth and low, polished into something that might have fooled a stranger. Bennett is 81, she said. He's vulnerable. He doesn't understand the stress you're putting on this family. I stood in my kitchen, the same kitchen where 9 plates had gone cold, and watched the dishwasher light blink because I still had not emptied it from Thanksgiving. He understands enough to know his money is gone. There was a pause, small and sharp. You're being manipulated, she said. That almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was familiar. People like Celeste always accused you of the thing they were doing, hoping the mirror would confuse you. I did not argue. I had learned from Marisol that arguments were where facts went to get muddy. I only said, any future questions can go through my attorney. Then I hung up. For the next several days, they shifted tactics like weather. Tessa sent soft messages about healing. Nolan sent angry ones about loyalty. Celeste sent nothing in writing after that first call, which told me she had finally understood that paper could remember. Marisol filed the emergency petition on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, the temporary order came through. Celeste's power of attorney was suspended pending review. Bennett's house sale was frozen. A formal accounting was requested for every dollar moved since March. I read the order twice in my parked car outside the courthouse. I did not feel victorious. I felt steady. Then I thought about the Calder Family Gratitude Dinner coming before Christmas, the performance Celeste was building inside Bennett's house, and I knew she should not learn about the order over the phone. She had always loved a table. So I decided the truth would meet her at one. Celeste held the Calder Family Gratitude Dinner on the second Sunday of December, because nothing said devotion like a printed invitation and candles arranged by height. I saw the photos before I saw the house. Tessa posted the front porch first, Bennett's old brick colonial glowing under white Christmas lights, a wreath on the door, gold ribbon tied around the porch rail. Underneath, she had written, celebrating family, faith, and the man who made us who we are. I sat in my car across the street and read that sentence twice. Bennett had made them who they were. That part was true. The problem was what they had become. In the passenger seat was my binder, tabbed and quiet. Beside it sat the apple cider bread pudding, still warm under foil, the top browned and sugared the way Bennett liked it. I had not made it for Celeste. I had made it because Elodie deserved something of hers in that room besides a secret. Marisol arrived 5 minutes after I did, wearing a dark wool coat and carrying a slim leather folder. Lydia came next, nervous but steady, her nursing notes sealed in a manila envelope. June Whitaker, Bennett's old neighbor, stepped out of a rideshare with a cane in one hand and a small box of photographs in the other. You look like her, June said when she saw me. It was the first thing she had ever said to me. Not hello, not sorry. Just the truth, offered plainly. We walked up together. For a moment, standing at that door, I was 8 years old again, waiting to be told whether I was welcome. Then I shifted the warm dish in my hands and remembered the court order in Marisol's folder. I was not asking for a chair anymore. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room stopped in layers. Conversation first, then silverware. Then Tessa's laugh, cut clean in half. Nolan froze near the mantel with a drink in his hand. Graham stood by the window and went gray around the mouth. Celeste came toward me fast, smiling for the guests and hissing for me. What are you doing here? I held the bread pudding with both hands. Bringing dessert. This is family only, she said. Before I could answer, Bennett's voice came from the head of the dining room table. Then she stays. He pushed himself up from his chair, one hand braced on the table, his body fragile but his eyes clear. She was family, he said, before most of you learned how to spell the name. No one moved. So I walked to the table Celeste had set so beautifully, placed Elodie's dessert beside her candles, and laid my binder down next to it. I did not slam the binder open. I set my hand on it for one breath, long enough to feel the room leaning toward me, then I opened to the first tab. My mother's name was Elodie Calder, I said. The sentence moved through the dining room differently than ordinary sound. June lowered herself into a chair. Graham closed his eyes. Celeste's face tightened, not with surprise, but with the fury of someone hearing a locked door open from the wrong side. I placed the birth certificate on the table, beside the bread pudding still giving off the smell of apples and cinnamon. I was not the child you made room for, I said. I was the daughter you made disappear. No one laughed. No one corrected me. June reached into her box and slid out a photograph of Elodie at 19, barefoot in Bennett's backyard, grinning at whoever stood behind the camera. She had your mouth, June said softly, and your stubborn chin. That almost undid me, but I stayed with the paper. Paper had carried me this far. I turned to the next tab. Since March, after Bennett's stroke, money has been moved out of his accounts under Celeste's authority. Celeste stepped forward. You have no right. Marisol's voice cut in, calm as a closed file. She does. Mr. Calder authorized her review, and the court has already received the petition. The word court changed the air. I read the numbers in order. 18,500 to Tessa, 14,200 to Nolan, 27,900 toward Celeste's SUV, 31,600 for a kitchen Bennett did not live in, 22,000 toward Nolan's taxes, 9,800 connected to the attempted sale of Bennett's home. Then I gave them the number that mattered most. His care account held $186,400. By Thanksgiving, it held $3,740. Lydia laid her nursing notes beside the bank records. Several signatures were taken on days he was documented as disoriented or unable to follow basic explanations. Celeste looked at Bennett. Dad, tell them. Tell them I handled everything. Bennett's hand trembled on the table, but his voice did not. You handled me, he said. Marisol opened her folder. As of Friday, Celeste Calder's power of attorney is temporarily suspended. The house sale is frozen. A formal accounting has been ordered. For once, Celeste had no sentence ready. Graham looked at me then, broken and late. She was Elodie's baby, he said. I closed the binder. I don't want Bennett's money, I told the room. I don't want this house. I want a neutral fiduciary watching every dollar, and I want him safe in his own home. No one at that table had to give me permission anymore. A year later, I set 9 places again. Bennett sat at the head. Marisol brought wine. Lydia brought flowers. June brought stories about Elodie. The bread pudding sat warm in the center. This time, every chair was filled by someone who chose to be there. And I finally understood. I did not need Celeste's table. I had built my own. What Mara learned was not just that some people will lie to protect money. She learned something harder. Some people will lie to protect the version of themselves they need the world to believe. Celeste needed to be seen as generous. Graham needed to be seen as peaceful. Tessa and Nolan needed to believe they were entitled, not taking. And for all of that to work, Mara had to stay small. She had to stay grateful. She had to stay quiet, at the edge of a table that was never truly set for her. But life has a way of returning the truth to the person strong enough to carry it. Sometimes that truth comes loudly. Sometimes it arrives with a lawyer, a court order, or a room full of witnesses. But sometimes it comes quietly, in an old envelope, in a faded photograph, in a recipe your hands remember before your heart understands why. Mara's victory was not that Celeste was exposed. Her real victory was that she stopped asking people who hurt her to define her worth. She stopped confusing usefulness with love. She stopped believing that being tolerated was the same as belonging. And that is a lesson many of us learn late. Family is not proven by a last name, a holiday invitation, or a seat at a table where your pain is treated like an inconvenience. Family is proven by care, by honesty, by the people who protect you when there is nothing to gain, by the ones who count the empty chair when everyone else pretends not to see it. Healing does not always mean getting an apology. Sometimes healing means building a life where the apology no longer has power over you. Mara did not get the family she begged for. She built the family she deserved. And maybe that is the strongest kind of recovery. Not becoming hard, not becoming cruel, but becoming clear. Clear enough to walk away from the table that starved you. Clear enough to set your own. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to stop begging for a place where you were never truly welcomed? Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to remember their worth.